Good evening, everybody. I'm a little confused, clearly. And welcome to tonight's Sappy Hour, where people are just kind of filtering into the webinar, and we'll get started in 1 second. This is a really exciting topic tonight. We're going to be talking about far northern atlasing. We've got a great panel and two great presentations, at least, lined up already. So yeah. Welcome to everybody. We're going to start out with a few housekeeping things, and then I'm going to introduce our panel of experts here that you can see on the screen all around me. But before we do any of that, I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement, which I know can seem a little bit strange, seeing as we're all meeting virtually from different places across Ontario, maybe even from further afield. However, wherever you are joining us from tonight, you are situated on Indigenous traditional lands and treaty lands as well. I personally happen to be in Toronto, and these are the treaty lands and traditional territories of a variety of different groups, and in specific, those are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as other Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, also the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and in particular, the Seneca, and also the Huron-Wendat. And I'm also on Dish with One Spoon Wampum territory, which is a pre-colonial treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. And if you are not aware of which treaty lands and traditional territories you are joining us from tonight, we're going to put a great link to a website where you can find out, and it's native-land.ca, just in case you were curious about that. And I think that you should be. Before I introduce these great people that we're here with tonight, I'm also just going to do a little bit of housekeeping, because apparently it's the future and we're coming to you one of two different ways tonight. So some of you are here with us in Zoom, and that means that as the presentations are going on, you may have some questions for the speakers and for the rest of the panel, which is great. Please put those in the Q&A tab in Zoom. Try not to put them in the chat. It's just a lot easier for us to keep track of them in the Q&A specifically. If you are, however, joining us on Facebook, where we are live streaming, very exciting, you can also ask questions in the comments of the video, and we'll look at those before we get to the Q&A section of tonight as well. So be sure to do that. Don't think we won't see you. And unfortunately, if you do watch the video on Facebook and it's not live, well, we'll do our best to answer your questions after the fact, but it may get a little more difficult if the longer that time goes on. So if you have never been to a Sappy Hour before, it's our version at the Ontario Brooding Bird Atlas of a very casual happy hour of sorts, where we just, talk about give people some Atlas information in a fairly informal setting. Tonight, we're going to have two very short presentations, and then we're going to open it up to questions after the fact for probably around half of our time here tonight. And in terms of who's going to be answering those questions and presenting, we have a pretty big and exciting group today, and I'll introduce them now. So 3 of these faces here, if you've been to any Sappy Hours before, you know them well. They are regulars. I'll start with Mike Cadman, if he wants to give a bit of a wave. Mike Cadman's our Atlas coordinator, not just for this Atlas, but the previous 2, and he, kind of handles everything to do with the Atlas. So he's a great resource. We also have Kaylin Bumelis, who's going to wave at you now. And she's the assistant coordinator for the Atlas. And if you've tried to make contact with the Atlas, had any concerns or questions, I'm sure you know her. She's just our general indispensable human being to do with Atlasing. We also have Mike Burrell, who I'm sure you are already familiar with. Mike Burrell is on, I believe, the technical committee, the significant species committee. He's a fervent Atlaser and involved in the management of the project in a huge way, and very handy on things like data submission. And then we also have a couple of new faces. So we have Adam Timpf here. Adam Timpf is a technician with the Canadian Wildlife Service, and he's a researcher for some of the logistic aspects of atlasing in the far north this time around. And yeah, he'll be able to tell us a little bit about the planning for that, how that's going. And then last but certainly not least, our guest of honor, as it were, is Michael Runtz. And Michael he didn't send me his bio, but I know that he is a consummate naturalist, well-known naturalist, birder, experienced atlaser, photographer, author, and he'll be sharing a lot about his personal experiences in previous atlases doing this far north work and surveying, which is very exciting. That's a lot for me, so I'm gonna go away in a second, and I think we're gonna start by turning it over to Mike Cadman just to give a little 10-minute summary of atlasing in the far north.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Emily. Hope everyone can hear me. Kaylin, if you could pull a slideshow up, that would be great. And I'll just sort of walk people through that. And like Emily says, this is a very exciting part of the Atlas project. Sort of my favorite part is getting everybody into the north and filling in this vast area that so little is known about, that we can really add to the knowledge of, and hopefully the conservation of, as we move forward. So mostly going to be talking about canoe trips tonight, and talking about mostly the far north, and I'll sort of explain about that a little bit more as we go. But just want to point out, canoe trips is a couple of varieties there. One is where you just get in your canoe and paddle downstream, although getting to the starting point can be a lot of fun. And the other one is when we'll be working out of a number of First Nations communities, particularly along the coast, and then getting local folks there to take us up the rivers in their boats, dropping us off in canoes, and having people work their way back to the community. So just wanted to start with a slide of that. So next slide, Kaylin. So as Emily said, we've done this before, and just sort of to convince you, the little map at the bottom right there shows we have indeed got into all of those blocks in Atlas 2 and got some amount of coverage. Didn't quite make our targets in all of the squares, I think four blocks there that we didn't quite get up to the total number of hours that we were hoping for, but very close to meeting our goals across there. Yeah, if I could have the next slide, Kaylin. And when you look at where we did the point counts, just a small smattering of points. It looks pretty small, but it's a huge amount of effort to get all that done. As you can see, again, we got the point counts done in every block but one, and I guess a partial block along the coast there. That one right in the middle of Northern Ontario, we had a crew all lined up to go, and then fire issues meant there weren't planes available to get people up into that area. And unfortunately in Atlas 2, we didn't get to that one. So we'll probably put a tack on that one and make that one a high priority for Atlas 3. Next slide then, Kaylin. And the intention, of course, is to collect data up there so that we can provide maps, provide a better understanding of the status of the birds in the north, the distribution, and particularly the relative abundance of the birds, where they're most concentrated. And of course, this is very valuable for conserving the birds, learning more about them. And in this atlas, we're going to be able to see how those patterns have changed from Atlas 2 20 years ago. Next slide then, Kaylin. And so, as you know, we've broken the region, the whole of the north, down into regions, and these are the main contacts for each of those regions. Mike Burrell on the call and Rod Brook coordinate activities in region 43, the Hudson Bay area. And then what we call Big Trout Lake, region 44. If you're interested in that area, contact Kaylin at the Atlas office. And then there's Adam's contact info there. He's going to be, he's working already on pulling together the logistics to get all these trips going. In that box with Adam, I've got the logistics committee, and we are in the process of reforming a group. We had a group earlier, but with COVID and such, we weren't able to work in the far north, so we sort of put that committee aside, but they're just in the process now of getting back together, and they're going to be working with Adam to get all of this going. It is a huge endeavor to get all these people into all of these blocks and out safely. So want to make sure all of that is in place before people start going up. And then, of course, in the road accessible part of the province, south of region 43 and 44, regional coordinators in place right across there, and they're Contact info is on the website, and certainly encourage everybody to be heading up and helping those guys fill out their regions. A lot of help going to be needed in that part of the world. Next slide, Caitlin. Okay, so in terms of goals, then our goals are to get into about 2% of the squares in the far north, which doesn't sound like many, but it really is. And the ones that we're targeting this time are those that we did in Atlas 2. We're going to pretty much try and repeat as much of the work as we can that we got done in Atlas 2, which gives us much better potential to do a comparison over time. So not only repeating the trip, but trying to get to the same squares and trying to get to as many as possible of the same actual point counts. We're still working out what the priorities are exactly in that middle part of the province. We have a number of priority squares set, but we don't have them all set. And we should have those in place sometime, I would hope, early in the new year. Give people time to plan to fill in the rest of that area, the road accessible north there. And then just showing that the box on the right there, that far north is going to be covered by canoe-based trips, mostly on rivers. There are M&R is active in the north, and we're going to be taking advantage of their opportunities. We're working with them to see how we can work together in the north there. As I said earlier, motorized canoes is going to be helping us get around on the coast, and we're going to be flying into remote locations here and there on the coast. As well as this time, it's looking like we'll be doing a lot of flights on commercial airlines. Most of the First Nations communities in the north are on regular flights with airlines, and we're probably going to be doing a lot of that this time and working with the communities more closely. But next slide, Caitlin. And there are those Indigenous communities. The Atlas, as you know, has an Indigenous engagement committee that we've already been in touch with each of the communities. And we're actually in the process of establishing a liaison. We're working with Ontario Nature, one of our partners. They have an intern we're going to be working with who's going to be helping us in actually now starting to contact the remote communities and work out how we're going to get these trips to operate. We're certainly going to be informing them of our plans so they know we're coming. We're going to be asking permission to use the reserve lands and to visit their communities. We need, of course, to be straight about COVID. All of this is going to be dependent on our being able to visit these sites given the COVID protocols. And then we want to try and involve the Northern community members in the project. We want to learn from them what they can tell us about where the birds are. Obviously, their logistical knowledge, their skills, their knowledge of the landscape. We want to be working with them to learn more and learn more about how to get in and out safely. We're going to be involving community members in data collection to the extent that they're interested in doing so. That's probably going to involve a lot of acoustic recordings using acoustic recorders, ARU devices, and Zoom units. And again, those kind of processes are already underway. Some communities are already putting out ARUs over this last year, and we've got quite a bit of data that's already coming into the system that'll be telling us about what's going on in the areas in and around those communities. We're, of course, hoping to involve Indigenous folks in guiding and helping us get around the landscape up there, and quite likely going to be doing a lot of canoe rentals through those communities. Next slide, Caitlin. So for Atlas 3, if we repeat the canoe trips from Atlas 2 in the far north, there were 18 of these river trips that we'd like to do. As I said, we want to cover the trips, we want to cover the same squares and the point counts to the extent we can. Most of the canoe trips will be 4 people in 2 canoes. There's going to be guides involved in at least, I would say, very likely most of the trips that are in what we call polar bear country. Everything there along Hudson Bay, the northern half of James Bay. There's potential for polar bears, particularly in July. And so most of our trips will try and be out of there before July, but some of the trips undoubtedly will roll over into early July. And there's potential for a small number of bears in there, and bears have been known to go inland. So we're sort of drawing the rule at anything within 100 kilometers of the Hudson Bay coast. We want to have the people involved have to be carrying firearms or with guides who can help protect them from bears should that become an issue. These trips that we're going on, most of the trips, the canoe trips will probably be 2 weeks in the field. It takes about 1 week to cover a 100 kilometer block in the north, and covering 2 squares in that block and doing all the point counts and traveling in between and all the other things that are required. Next slide, Kaylin. And so we're starting to zoom down a bit, get a little closer to our planning. And so these red dots here, those are the clusters of point counts that were done along the Fawn River and then the Severn on one of our trips. So that trip went up and covered block DF and DG in Atlas 2, did those 4 squares that you can see. At the time, those squares were targeted as being representative of that whole 100 kilometer block, and the point counts they did were intended to be as representative as possible of the habitats in that 10 by 10 kilometer square. In reality, travel is very difficult away from the rivers, and well, you can see if you see the next slide, Kaylin, you'll see that the points tend to be very much clustered near the river, and trying to sample as many of the habitats as possible along those river corridors. So as you're paddling in here, you'll be trying to visit that same square, visit those same points. So you need to find a camp spot right in that same area. Presumably, with any luck, we'll find the same spot that was used by the group last time. And then each day spread out, do your atlasing and do your point counting around there. Of course, from the website, this map is right from the website. It's the Square Resources map, and you can get all the information there. You can download the point count locations and such for your phone or your GPS unit. Next slide, Kaylin. Okay, just a quick slide of the trip that Michael's going to tell you about, the Muketei River, that was done in 2005. We were just pinpointing what year that was. And again, you can see in this case, the pluses show the clusters of point counts along the Muketei, right up to where it joins with the Attawapiskat River, and another cluster of points done up there. Next slide, Kaylin. So we've come up with some suggested trips for this first year, or to get this process rolling. We don't know how many of these we'll be able to get going in 2022. We're going to get as many as we can. And if you've seen this information is on the website. You can see it there. You can look over those trips and let us know if you're interested in any of those, or if there are other trips you might be interested in. Again, let us know, and we can start working with you and seeing what will be possible. Maybe it's a good point to say that at the moment we're in the fundraising drive, trying to bring in the money to help pay for these trips. It's very expensive to put these trips on, and our hope is that we'll be able to assist with the cost of the flights in and out. In Atlas 2, we paid for the flights, and we paid for canoe rental and guides as that kind of thing was required, and the Atlasers were responsible for getting themselves to the area and then home again. And so we are acting on that same basis and hoping to raise the funds to do that. Whether we'll be successful or not, I'm not sure, but if we're not, we may be asking people to help contribute to the cost of the trip. Next slide, Kaylin. So really, for you, if you haven't yet, after this, go onto the website, and there's a Northern Atlasing application form at that link. If you just go onto the website under Get Involved, and then Northern, I think it's Northern Trips or Northern Information, and then click on there, it'll open up the application form for you, show you that map of the potential trips, and give you a link to the Northern Manual. Now, the Northern Manual is pretty intimidating. We've got a lot of information there about safety. It's very high priority for this project that everybody gets in and out safely. And so would encourage everybody to look through that and see what kind of things are involved, asking people to get trained on bear awareness and how to deal with bears, making sure they're able to survive in the wild, and are comfortable in wilderness conditions. So I'm going to hand things over now to Michael to talk about the Muketei River trip, but save up your questions, and we'll get a chance to have you ask those when Michael's through.
Great. Okay, thanks, Mike. And let me just share my screen here with you.
Looks good.
Okay, excellent. Good. Right. Well, I was very privileged to be able to do a few of the northern trips. And believe me, these are, in my opinion, the best trips during the Atlas, because you're in areas where there are no roads. You don't see anybody else but your companions for the 1 to 2 weeks you're on these trips. And you see some pretty amazing country that otherwise you wouldn't get a chance to see without being on the Atlas. So the Muketei is where was one of the trips. And I had some very good company on that trip. Judith King, seen here, her son Stephen, and John Rayum, who some of you probably know. So the four of us, we did have 2 canoes, so don't be misled by this photograph. But we set off. You start from Pickle Lake at Flown In, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Atlas got a break on the prices, about $7,000 round trip. So it's not, as Mike said, not a cheap proposition to be in the north. So we started the survey down here, and ended the survey where the Muketei meets the Atlassian River, 2004. Beautiful terrain from the air, and because you're traveling with the current, the paddling is really easy until you hit a rapid or two. So here we are at Pickle Lake, ready to take off. They strap the canoes onto the floats. And for those that haven't done much canoeing, it's highly recommended you do have experience in canoeing on these trips, and how to choose a canoe properly too. For example, we had choices of canoes, and those were our choices, but here's one to avoid. You see a canoe like this, do not use that canoe on the trip. It's not good. Apparently a black bear took a disliking to this canoe and ripped it apart. But in fact, we were told by the Pickle Lake charter flight people that we wouldn't see any bears on the trip. What did we see as we're landing at our first location? We saw a black bear, but that's the only one we saw the entire trip. So here we are. This is where we were supposed to land on this part of the Muketei. And as we flew in, the pilot says, I can't land there. It looks too shallow. I'm afraid of rocks or logs. We can't land there. So we landed on the river itself up here. So here we are unloading the canoes. And starting off with John, big smiles on our face because we're in this really wild country that has seen very, very few people. Right away, we saw a moose, set up our first camp very close to where we saw the moose. And the interesting part is when you start this trip on the Muketei, you're starting on the Canadian Shield, this really old rock. And you're at the edge of the shield. So you soon leave the Canadian Shield to get out into the limestone areas that underlie the Hudson Bay Lowland. And by the way, what a silly name, the Canadian Shield. It sounds like a birth control device for Mounties or something. It's an interesting term, but it refers to the rock being the shield. And here's another view where we were camping right across on that island to the top right of the picture. Right away, we found our first nest, spotted sandpiper, and then we carried on. And just to show you again, you can see the edge of here's a Muketei here, the Atlassian, Canadian Shield rock here, and then you're into the Hudson Bay Lowland. And a neat feature as we flew in, so here's we started, here's we entered. Okay, as we flew in, I get another little diagram here showing where we are. Okay, as we flew, we saw this feature right here and thought, what is that? Well, we soon learned as we paddled by, it was a really interesting, big sort of clay sand bank. And where we were right at the contact zone of the former Burrell Sea that was the predecessor to the Hudson Bay itself. And as the sea came inland after the last ice age, it went right up to the edge of the Canadian Shield being the boundary for it, the higher elevation. And so we were right at the junction of the two different types of rock in Ontario. The shoreline was like this. There are a lot of spruce, black spruce, very few white spruce, and very, very few balsam fir at the start. The balsam fir soon vanished. We heard birds. In fact, many of these photographs were not taken on the trip with the birds themselves, because we heard birds, but didn't see nearly as many. And that's where learning or knowing the songs and calls of birds is essential, because for every bird we saw, we probably heard 10 times or more that number calling. And the reason in part is this pretty dense shoreline. You can see the trees are quite dense, and there's a layer of shrubs beneath them that are quite dense. So from these shrubs, you would hear things. Here's the variety of willows. There's northern shrubs too. So several types of willows, silverberry and things like that. And from these, you'd hear song of fox sparrows and orange crown warbler. Here's an example of the rock type. So now we left the shield. We're going along the river through the sedimentary limestone. So different flora and different birds as well. Now, behind the shoreline, once you leave the spruce, what you see is this. And as you leave the Canadian Shield and start on the river there, the peatland you see behind the trees is fairly well developed. Not a lot of pools of water in that habitat. And there you have things like Lincoln sparrows singing. Oh, there's Lincoln sparrow there, and a few other species too. But as you go, and by the way, the maps we had, one set of rapids, we actually hit 7. So that was a lot of unexpected white water to navigate through, which we did for the most part by canoe. There's really no spot to portage because the dense shrub layer by the shore, by the shoreline. You have to usually rope your canoe through the shallows. You wade in the shallows and bring your canoe with you. A few ducks we saw, common goldeneye, mostly females, and common mergansers. So there were some nesting ducks along the river. Here's John helping pull the canoe along. We couldn't shoot the set of rapids, big boulders and so on, but for the most part, we shot them. See all the essential gear. You have to have a butterfly net with you for capturing birds. No, for perhaps catching dragonflies or butterflies if you get that lucky to see them on the excursion, plus camera gear and waterproof containers. Pelican cases are great for this. So we had no mishaps. And there were some dragonflies you see by the rapids, like the boreal snaketail. And we had at one spot, a Bohemian waxwing flew over calling. When you stop to wade through the rocks, that's when you start hearing things flying over. As you paddle along, you certainly hear some things, but the more time you spend in one location, the more birds you hear. And we had an exciting encounter with the Bohemian waxwing at one of the spots we were lining the canoe around the rapids. Is the shoreline with shrub layer, very dense shrub layer, and the spruce behind. And you can see there's nowhere really to walk along the shoreline in most places. So in terms of finding a campsite, it's not always that easy. So you tend to look for spots like this, where there's a bit of exposed. Now the danger is you're in low elevation, and as you can see, pretty close to the water. So if you happen to have one of those episodes that we're having currently in British Columbia, now in Newfoundland, or Nova Scotia, I should say, the waters could rise really quickly and you'd be in trouble. Now, I'm not sure in the manual, Mike, if it talks about number of tents you have to have on the trip. I don't think so. But, you can't have one with all those people unless you're close friends, and maybe that would work. But you have to have 1, 3 or more. You can never have 2, according to Mike. And apparently the reason is if you had just 2, that'd be a 2 tense situation. And you want to avoid that, any kind of tense situation on your trip. Okay, enough of that. Some really nice flora there, northern flora, the lagoonberry, the northern equivalent of okay, I was afraid of having a senior's moment. I'm not really that much of a senior, but it's been a rough couple of weeks. And come on. It's you'll come partway through the talk. Oh, good heavens! We have a red one down in the Elvars, and okay, we'll carry on. Alpine bistort, some really northern plants. We don't get, well, there are, I shouldn't say don't get down here, but there are disjunct populations on Lake Superior. And one of my favorites, a carnivorous flower, that pingula, the butterwort. with sticky leaf traps. So some neat stuff on the shoreline, but you're mostly in the canoe for a large part, as Mike said, going from point count to point count. And so you paddle by a lot of these things or drift by because the current is quite pleasant to work with. And somewhere in flower, there's the flower of this carnivorous plant. So lots there in addition to the birds, of course, but birds being the foremost part of the trip. Now, as you get down, you start to realize that it appears you're traveling through vast areas of boreal forest, but it's a facade. It's like an old Western movie where they have all these buildings set up, but they're just fronts, and behind is desert. Well, similar here too. Once you get through the black spruce and you start seeing some of the coniferous forest plants and hopefully some of the birds like bunchberry. These are actually photographs from walking through the spruce area with mosquitoes. And there were a number of mosquitoes, and you can use repellents if you want, but I don't use repellents. I didn't on this trip. And to me, it's just the price of admission. A few insect bites, big deal. And bunchberry, which by the way has the fastest moving floral parts in the world, the way the stamens spring up. Mountain cranberry was in there. And a couple of places we had oracled tway blade, one of the orchids. So some neat things as you walk through these mossy black spruce forests, but they're very narrow. And soon you're out in the opening. And in fact, I think I have an aerial photograph next, hopefully. Yeah, no, but you can see here, all of a sudden you're in the opening, and there is what is called muskeg, which is peatland that has sphagnum moss more than 45 centimeters deep and lots of water in it. It's really, in fact, we own the largest continuous track, one of the largest in the entire world, right here in Ontario. And that's a place where very few human feet have tread. And it's such a delight to get out there and suddenly see before your eyes the opening. And this is what you see. Lots of pools of water. These are floating mats. So walking in a straight line is impossible because of all the water. So you have to do very circuitous routes to get around. But here's what you see. I mentioned the facade. Well, here's an aerial view showing the river, and you can see the coniferous forest here, and then muskeg beyond that. And that's because the rivers carry material and they build it up, spring high water level, and they lower down. So along the edge here, you have higher deposits from the river, and therefore a bit drier habitat for the spruce to grow. And there you might encounter things like Canada jays and blackback woodpeckers. I don't think we had them along here, but there might be enough habitat for them. And here's a typical view inside the muskeg. John was so excited he wet his pants. No, he didn't do that. That's because you sink right down. And I asked Mike before this trip, I think it was you, Mike, I asked about type of footwear to wear. And he suggested that a lot of people wear running shoes with those neoprene socks inside them. And that's what we wore. And it's a good idea because there's cool moisture down there and you get wet feet, but then when you get back to your campsite, you take off your wet shoes and put something dry on and you're all set then. Of course, GPS and so on, so important to mark your locations and that. But what a treat though to explore habitat like this that has seen so few human beings. Some neat plants walking by, we weren't there to take photographs, so you had to really be, diligent and stick with the walking. But now and again, a quick snapshot. This is great sundew, one of the more northern species, and and the poor mosquito that tried to get me landed on that plant by mistake. Terrible, sad thing indeed. We didn't see very few herps on the trip because there aren't that many that far north, but we saw American toads. And these are large and really, really colorful in the Hudson Bay Lowland. And not just large and colorful. These toads are extremely strong. I mean, look at this toad here, bench pressing our canoe. Remarkable. And if you believe that, I could have some land for sale for you back at Arnper. But yeah, pretty amazing. And you can see, of course, a few scratches in our canoes from going through that white water. Luckily, the outfitters provide the canoes, and they're not the kind of light canoe to portage, but they're big and sturdy, and they handle hitting rocks pretty well in those rapids. Again, you hear more birds. This is not from that trip. I've heard them. We hear Sandhill Cranes. And of course, I think by this atlas, they'll be much more numerous through the northern areas. One nuisance, though, that you come across are the yellowlegs. If you're going by, here's a greater yellowlegs, by yellowlegs, they come flying in, they fly around you almost for the entire survey you're doing, and they scream vociferously in your ears. and it's hard to hear other birds. So maybe, Mike, we can provide guns for people to shoot these birds flying overhead. No, don't do that, of course. But the neat part was about the Hudson Bay Lowland, we also have lesser yellowlegs there too. And these really, in terms of nesting in Ontario, are not really found in the boreal forest farther south and west. They're actually more confined to the Hudson Bay Lowland. So it's a neat thing to see these birds, which are now in very sad decline in Canada. One of the highlights, though, from this trip for us was hearing Nelson sparrows sing. And we didn't see them. They were in a distant sort of wet sedge area that we couldn't get to. It was beyond our last point count. But we both clearly heard the songs of Nelson sparrows. They are quite different from Lacan sparrows. And so that was, to me, one of the highlights, because you're adding information, as Mike said, on these surveys. You're adding information, and the ability to encounter birds that were not expected to be there is really, to me, the highlight of this. So here's the Nelson sparrow map, and you can see a dot up here, and I believe that's the one that we added to the survey in that trip. Finally, after you paddle the Muketei for, I think, about 100 kilometers or so, you hit the Opposcat. And that is where we had our final camp, or picked up. And there we heard red-eyed vireos sing. And when you get up in the aircraft, so some really neat geology on the side. You can see rocks polished by the glaciers with scratches on them from the glaciers and so on. We encountered another herp there, a spring peeper. And by the way, these frogs are unique, not unique, but there are a number of frogs, 4 species, I think 5 in Ontario, that do not go to water for the winter. They burrow down near the soil surface and moss and so on, and they actually freeze over. Half their body water turns to ice. It's called freeze tolerance. American toads are not freeze tolerant, but they dig down below the frost line. So these 2 herps have different strategies for surviving those really northern tough conditions. But this is from the shore of the Atlassian. I mentioned red-eyed vireos, yes, and the reason we heard red-eyed vireos as we finally flew back, and it's kind of sad to leave. You want to keep on going on these northern trips. You want to see what lies ahead of the next bend of the river. But of course, you have to finish the survey as directed. And you can see here the rows of poplars in some areas. And this is where the vireos tended to sing from. But it wasn't, you can see it flows out then to the Atlassian, eventually gets out to James Bay. But it is these northern trips that I find to be the most exciting. And it takes a little bit of course, of ability to withstand being fairly isolated. And for many people, it's not comfortable. But for people like me that are just dispensable, it doesn't matter where we go, we don't care. And it's just a sheer delight to be in spots like this and see terrain that you would only see because you're on the Breeding Bird Atlas, or else extremely wealthy, so you can afford to fly in there in a private helicopter or something. But no, it's just fantastic. And I've had other northern experiences too, such as Hudson Bay itself, mouth of the Brant River on one side, and on the really northern trips, read the manual carefully, because I didn't, being stubborn, I just thought I knew everything about what to wear. I didn't bring a parka, and so it was pretty cold. I did bring gloves, though, which is good, but I didn't bring a toque, and that's really important too. I'd bring a toque in any northern trip because your ears can get cold, and I didn't bring a toque. So what I had to do, it's a little known secret, so don't pass it around. I put underwear on my head to keep my ears warm. You improvise. That's a key thing. You've got to improvise if you're in these northern areas, because you haven't got the luxury of going back home to pick something up. And by the way, it's my own underwear, in case you were wondering, so don't think otherwise of me, but it is a point that you must really read the manual and be prepared for these really tough northern conditions. But if you can tolerate that, you're going to be in a world unlike any other world you've seen. And that's it for this little review of the Muketei River trip that was done in 2004, apparently.
2005, Michael. But
2005, okay. I don't know why I said 2004, but well, my age, you're entitled to get mixed up now and again,
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate that. I don't know, Emily, do you want to handle questions? Have any questions been coming in?
We do have some questions. Let me just kind of take care of my questions tab. And I think more are going to start to come in now that the actual talk is done and people aren't riveted by the images anymore. The first question is one actually, Mike Cadman, that I think would be good for you. Somebody asked about whether you're planning with these northern trips and targeting the Ring of Fire area. Can you answer that?
We're not sort of going out of our way to target that area more than any others. Our goal is very much to do what we did last time. We'll certainly be working in the Ring of Fire area, and we're certainly hoping we'll be getting extra data, because there's a lot of other work going on in the Ring of Fire area. That our wildlife service biologists are very active up in that area, and a lot of consultants are working up there. So we will get a lot of data from the Ring of Fire, whether or not we send crews in. But our target is going to be very much focused on repeating those trips and getting back to those same places we were last time.
Makes a lot of sense. My next one is from the Facebook comment section. And this may either be for Adam Timpf or for Mike Cadman. You'll decide amongst yourselves. But somebody asks, are the 8 trips, Mike, that you kind of outlined, some of the priority trips, are those the ones that are those going to happen throughout the Atlas, or are those just ones that you're planning on doing in the next season? And will there be more added afterwards?
Yeah, our goal is to get all. Oh, yeah. Do you want to take it, Adam?
Yeah, well, I was just going to mention that on my logistics spreadsheet, I have about 60 lines, and not all those lines are going to be trips that volunteers are going to take, but I would say a good 40 to 50 of them could potentially be. And so we're going to try and do as many of them as over the next 4 years.
Okay, not just 8 as well. If you're watching this, it's going to be a lot more.
Yeah, and those ones, we really laid those out just to sort of demonstrate the fact that, yeah, we're going to go in 2-block chunks as much as we can. And those were ones that had done before that were sort of low-hanging fruit ones that would be fairly easy to get done. And we knew they were all readily done and safely done with not a lot of rapids and that kind of thing. And our goal isn't particularly to get them all done in the first year, but we'd certainly like to get some of those done, as many as possible.
Okay, that's great. I think that's the answer that they wanted, so that's great. This next one, maybe we'll put it over to Michael Runtz first, and then anyone else can chime in. From your experience, how many kilometers of canoeing would you undertake per day over a 2-week trip? They also asked if you did any portaging, but I think that you already answered that question.
Right. Yeah, that's an easy part. There was no portaging. In terms of distance per day, that's a good question. I can't remember, to be honest, but it was, as I recall, it was really easy paddling because you're going with the current. In fact, you just sort of had to not even steer sometimes, just sit back and enjoy the free ride. It was beautiful that way. I wouldn't want to do that trip in reverse, though. it'd be impossible, to be deadly. But I think we're covering pretty good ground, and maybe 10 kilometers or more some days. But it was really easy work because of the current going with you all times. Maybe 20 kilometers some days. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe.
And can you talk about how long in the day that would take? Like how much there was travel versus non-travel?
Well, that's a good one. Oh boy. Yeah, well, non-travel, there's probably more time non-traveling doing the point counts and that, because you're in an area for a couple of days. And so if I had to break it down, I would say probably more time doing atlasing. Well, you're doing atlasing from the canoe too as you're going along. But in terms of being out of the canoe, the number of hours probably exceed that in the canoe overall.
Okay. Sorry, Mike Cadman, you had something, I think, to add to that too, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I did a trip down the Fawn in 1983. It was the first one that sort of launched this whole idea of whether we could actually do atlasing in the north. So it was pretty exciting. But we did a variety of things. And one of the things we did, we get up at the crack of dawn, and dawn is early up there. You know, the sun's up. I forget what time, but it was very early. Yeah, 3 or 4 o'clock, and we would just pack up camp on moving days extremely early, and then just float and just listen to the birds as you're going. It depends on the width of the river, but where we were at that in the early stages on the Fawn, you could hear both sides of the river, and it was just marvelous floating along in the quiet, listening to the birds. But other days, if we were really booting it, we had, I remember one particular day, we were clipping along at 10 kilometers an hour with the flow. And so we're able to cover a lot of ground. But as Michael said, most of the time is spent around in those base squares at a base camp, covering the area. And then you might have a day or two of travel in between.
Sounds great to mix it up. Okay, we have a couple that Mike, Burrell, and Kaylin were nice enough to kind of direct over here from Facebook. So I'll ask a couple of those. Somebody asked that you mentioned that we need firearms for protection against polar bears. Are you also going to outfit crews with bear spray, either instead of or in addition to?
I don't think we're going to outfit people with bear spray. If people want to bring bear spray, that's going to be up to them, and we recommend it. There's going to be issues with commercial flights and such and bear spray, and we have to work through the logistics of that. But yeah, it's sort of a recommended thing to have, but we would expect bear spray. I think people would bring their own. Although it's a good question. If we do have some, we could probably make a loan of them, because they're not going to get used very often, one would hope.
Hopefully, yeah.
My wife just cut in here too. On our trip, we had no bear spray. None of us brought it because it wasn't really a perceived risk, for one thing. And we saw that one bear the entire trip. Now, other surveys will bring people into more contact with bears, but a key thing is, I think, when you're in a group of 4 people, especially, make sure there's somebody who's slower than you are. And then you'll feel much more comfortable when you do your point counts. No, but seriously though, it's a perceived risk, and for the most part. But if I was in a habitat where there was a greater chance of encountering bears, especially females with cubs, which are still relatively safe to be near, but there are occasions where you want to have the benefit of having some sort of protection if you need it. And I'm not sure, Mike, if any Atlasers in the last Atlas had any bad experiences with bears. Do you recall any?
I didn't hear of any.
Yeah. And that's a lot of people, a lot of hours out in the wilds.
Yeah.
It shows you how rare this risk is. And, all my life I've spent out, well, not always in remote areas, but areas where there are bears. And I've never, I had to carry bear spray in Jasper for grizzly bears, but I left that behind after a couple of days. Again, the risk is low, especially with black bears and even polar bears in Ontario. I don't know of any cases of polar bears attacking people, but still it is a possible risk. And so you should, if you feel more comfortable and you're allowed to bring bear spray, then certainly do so. But you can always use it on food too, on some nice spicy food if you want, if you don't use it on bears.
But not your surveying companions, hopefully. Okay.
No.
So we have a couple of questions that are fairly similar, and I'll lump them together. And it's about what sort of whitewater experience or that you might need to be able to handle one of these trips. Who would like to answer that one? Who's best at? Maybe we'll start with Mike Cadman, and maybe Adam, you have something to add too. I don't know.
Yeah, it varies with the trip. The trip that we did was 2.5 weeks on the river, and we hit one set of rapids, and we knew it was there. It was well advertised. There was another set shown on the map, but the water was high enough. We just glided right over it. And it was a substantial rapids, a mile long, and it took us half a day to portage around it. But in that case, it was on the Severn River, and it was quite wide, and there was it was easy walking. And actually the trip that repeated our trip in the second Atlas, they lined their canoe all the way down that, but we carried ours back in 1983. But these trips are certainly the ones on the lowlands. Michael's trip was a bit of an exception. There were more rapids on that trip because he was actually dropping off the shield onto the lowlands.
Yeah.
Most of the trips, like the Sashigo trips, and a lot of them down the Winisk, and where we're going to be going on the Attawapaskat and the Ekwan, those are all on the lowlands, and generally very few rapids on the lowlands. And the experience seems to be they're not all that challenging to handle. And certainly on these trips that we've promoted to this point, there's not a lot of rapids to worry about.
And Mike, on the Muketei, the outfitters at Pickle Lake gave training if you wanted training before. So there was, I think, half a day session of learning if you didn't know much about whitewater, how to navigate through it.
Yeah, we'd certainly recommend people take a Whitewater River course before going. It's a lot of stuff on there about rescue, and I took a course recently, and it really good, really useful, a lot of fun, and a good thing to have the experience.
Have general. Adam, did you have something to add as well? I thought that you may have.
Probably not much. I talked to one outfitter, and the one river, he said you're going to be probably dragging your canoe along that time of year. So I think if there's any set of rapids you're comfortable with, you can sort of line it down yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, because the trip we did, we think we started on June the 15th out of Big Trout Lake. And the folks up there told us the ice had just gone out of the lake a couple of days before we got there. So the water was still fairly high at that time, but flowing along nicely, and we didn't have any trouble. But had we been there a week earlier, it would have been a lot more problematic.
Part of the adventure. So we do have a lot of more questions to get through. So I'm gonna move along a little bit. We have a couple of questions that again are similar, that are just about the level of expertise in terms of not canoeing now, but bird identification that would be required in order to be a valuable participant on a trip. Mike Cadman, do you want to start with that? What level of bird ID do you need?
Well, I 2 of the 4 people on each trip should be able to do point counts up there. The other 2 don't. The more skills they have, the better. But we often tried to pair people up, so we had people who are really skilled in wilderness survival with folks who are really good on the birding side. So if you're interested, you don't have to have all the skills yourself. We'll try and find others that you can work with. But yeah, a couple of people on each trip should be able to do the point counts up there.
And in terms of testing it, because there were some questions about that, I know that we're planning pretty soon with the Atlas on having some sample recordings from the north that will be available on the website. So I think very soon you'll be able to kind of go to those, listen to some recordings and see, can you identify the songs that, in that recording? And if so, you're probably good to go. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, well, I'll mention too that the birds all have different dialects up there.
Yes.
A few days to figure that's a yellow warbler. Okay.
Yeah, true.
Quite surprising how different that was. And I haven't told even the panel on this yet, but 2 weeks from now, I'm hoping that our next Sappy Hour will be devoted to those recordings and to this process we have with the University of Alberta folks with this thing called Wild Tracks is going to manage our recorded files. And so we'll talk a lot more about that in a couple of weeks.
Okay, this is a preview, everybody. Yeah, pretty good. That's true. I know things like song sparrow, yellow warbler, they change a lot. So maybe don't feel too bad if there's a few mysteries on the recordings.
And I might say too that call notes are important too, not just songs, but call notes. For example, we had common redpolls, a couple of locations, and they weren't in song, they were just call notes. So knowing individual species call notes is also, I think, a pretty important thing. But the nice part is the species diversity is not really high in the lowland. It's certainly higher in the boreal forest as you get further south. And so if someone has some experience with the species, but not extensive, then as you said, going through these learning aids would be a big benefit. And especially don't just listen to the songs, also the call notes can be important too.
Good point. Okay, here's one again for Mike and Adam, probably Mike Cadman. This one is just about roughly, and I know we don't know all of the details of the finances yet, what do you expect it might cost somebody personally to volunteer for one of these trips? Yeah, can you?
Well, that's a real good question. It depends. I mean, really want you to provide your own tent and sleeping bags and sleeping mats and all that side of things, to your own binoculars. You want to be covered there. Your out-of-pocket costs beyond that, ideally, will be just really getting to the north and getting back. But and whatever that is, I imagine most people will drive. Some people have certainly flown up, take the train, that kind of thing. There are a number of options there. But yeah, beyond that, the costs of the flights, we've been a little startled. Because of COVID, it's been hard to communicate with a lot of the businesses are actually closed down. Actually, the outfitter out of Pickle Lake, who was so fantastic, they didn't close down because of COVID, but they closed down, and so that's really hurt. And so we're sort of figuring out how we're going to get back into all these places. So we're starting to get prices. Adam's been working on that, pulling together the prices for these trips. And at the moment, it's a little scary. So in terms of the float plane costs, so we're looking at other options. Like I mentioned, it may be possible to, instead of flying to the Sassago River, we might fly into the Sassago Lake community, First Nations community, and then paddle down, rent canoes from them and paddle downstream from there. So it would be a modified version of the same trip, but the logistics would be different. But again, our goal would be to again, cover the cost of the flights, but at this point, not sure how much each people will be asked to contribute.
I think you made everybody a little nervous, but I like that the message is stay tuned. And hopefully things get sorted out.
Absolutely.
Adam, did you have anything to add to that? Because you said you were compiling some prices, or are we good?
Just what Mike said, like Pickle Lake doesn't seem to be an option to fly out of there at all. So just some of the flights are a little bit farther, and price of gas right now. And yeah, it's, if you had to pay out of pocket, it'd be, potentially 10,000 each way. And so, you're not going to be asked to cover that by the Atlas by any stretch. So, if in the end you had to cover, you're driving in a hotel room, you're still getting a super good deal.
It's true. Yeah, it's not an opportunity that you'd get for this price most of the time, for sure. This is a very important question that I can't believe only one person asked. So I'm going to ask, I think we'll start with Michael Runtz on this one. How are meals planned on your trip? How did you work that out? It's important to keep everybody happy.
Yeah, very good question. And what we did was often the people that are part of the Ford team are really experienced in canoeing and camping. And generally one of them will drop a meal plan. And so one person was in charge of organizing the food. And if you're flying into a remote spot, there's a weight limit. And so you have to calculate how much you could actually bring. But just a meal plan is passed around to all the members of the group and approved then. And it's funny, we did the Hudson Bay trip, Brant River trip. The fellow in charge of food miscalculated the weight and actually brought only half the weight of food instead of the full amount of weight. So we had all this dried stuff while other camps had, I think they had hams and they had eggs and all this wonderful food. And we had a very different menu. So make sure the person that's in charge of getting the food or drawing the food list, and you just plan your meals and make sure that you hit the maximum weight you're allowed instead of half the weight you're allowed, because otherwise you go pretty hungry sometimes.
Yeah. And don't forget the coffee. I heard a story from somebody that coffee was forgotten on one of the trips, and that doesn't seem like a recipe for success. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
No, I'm just thinking maybe we should come up with a sort of generic Atlas meal plan for the 2-week period or something. Maybe if anybody has anything along those lines, thought for 2-week canoe trips, let us know, because that kind of thing would be good to share around for folks doing it. And
I suspect now, Mike, it might be more complex with food plans because some people are vegetarian, some are vegan. That's going to be more difficult, I think, this time around. And on these long canoe trips that you're doing 2 weeks, like this could pose a challenge. So that could be a factor as well, who goes on the trip.
Okay, a couple more questions. Some we've kind of answered. Okay, so there is this application process. You have this online application. Somebody's asked, after you've submitted it, whenabouts can you expect to hear back? When will you know if you've been accepted for the Northern Adventure?
Well, there's a good question. Kaylin, have we got any applicants in yet? I heard at least wanted, we had at least one applicant. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I think we will sit down and start to think about specific trips. I guess it will depend on if we have a team of 4 that want to do one particular trip and that's all ready, then we can start discussions and start that whole process, try and work out the logistics and start that process up. If you're an individual, you might have to wait till you've got a team together and can make decisions on where you want to go. So, you know, it'll probably be staggered, but we will try and get that process rolling probably before Christmas. I know Adam's already working on the logistics for one particular trip. We've got a team of 4 that's expressed interest, so starting to work out how we'll do that one.
Okay. Anyone have anything to add to that?
I was just going to say, we have about 20 people who have applied so far or filled out the application so far.
Ooh, nice. Okay. Okay, a couple of, so that kind of answers most. Sorry, I'm just looking through some of the questions just to make sure that we haven't missed anything. Okay, somebody has asked this. So it sounds like a lot of trips have 4 people. A lot of people will kind of apply with their cohort of 4 and they'll be, you know, good to go. But are you in the business of matching people up if, say, they're in a pair or a single and they don't have a full group?
Yeah, very much. The trip that, I went on that first one, we were just 4 individuals, didn't know each other at all before the trip. And, you know, got together in the months ahead and planned everything through. And that happened with quite a number of the trips. I think, well, I guess on Michael's trip.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Judith and her son and Michael and
yeah, and they're all new to me. So yeah, put together and it worked out really well.
Now you have new friends for life. Perfect. Wow. So there's a lot of really finicky, well, not finicky, but detailed questions. We'll cover maybe a few more. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. Let's see here. Somebody did ask, this is kind of interesting. You put out your first kind of, I think it's 8 or 9 trips. Somebody's asked, can we have access to Adam's list of 40 plus trips to think about and plan, or do you want us to focus on just the first 8 for now? What do we think about that?
Oh, yeah, we could. I don't know if Adam's list is sort of ready for distribution, but we could make a wider list available. Those were just really to get people thinking about it. And as I said, there were the kind of low-hanging fruit that we know they're well-established trips that worked well last time. So yeah, I think we could work on getting let's say an extended list. I don't know if all of the ones that are on Adam's list we make available, but those that are well suited to a team of volunteers, we could try and put together. I'll make a note.
Adam, you better get that spreadsheet in order. Okay. Okay, we'll do one more. I guess. I think we've basically covered most of these and answered them kind of in course. Maybe 2. Okay, so one said, Toby Roland here asks, can you apply to survey in future years? If you know that you're not able to go this season, can you kind of reserve a spot on a trip, you know, a couple years in advance? Is that something that you're doing or it's possible?
I haven't really thought as far as reserving, but if you had a team of 4, let's say, and you had a trip in mind and you said, yeah, we can't do it till 2024, we could certainly work around that and see if that would make sense logically, and if it did, no reason not to do that. I think if people express, say, an interest in going in 2023, they can't go in 2022. We'll certainly have we'll keep that active and be trying to match people up as soon as we can that are on a similar schedule, and see if we can get those trips populated.
Okay, that's great. Oh God, these really good last minute questions keep coming in. So we'll go till you guys cut me off. Somebody wants to know who's responsible. So in, you know, the very unlikely event of a disaster, who's responsible for emergency evacuation costs or things of that nature?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And our management committee is actually meeting later this, well, before Christmas, I hope, and that's one of the things on the agenda, to sort of work that through. We do intend, I didn't mention it, but we do intend to provide everybody with satellite phones. If you're going into the really remote areas like that, you will have satellite phones, and there will be some form of daily check-in requirement. What we haven't yet decided is how that's going to work. Are we going to have a central place that will deal with all that, or will each crew be responsible for their own check-in procedures? As far as the costs of emergency evacuation, I don't know off the top of my head. We had one emergency evacuation in Atlas 2.
Yep, I was there.
And that was just because of bad weather on the coast. And we did cover the cost of that. But again, our committee will be getting together to discuss that over the next couple of months. Yeah.
Okay. And that rescue, by the way, wasn't so much a rescue. We had a big storm, and the tents were destroyed, but the sun came out at the end of the 37 hours. And, we could rebuild. And I was very heartbroken, Mike, to have those helicopter come in to pull us out. Really, I wanted to stay, but they wouldn't let me. Unfinished business there on the tundra. So I should get my name in. I've got a clean bill of health, by the way, now. So, so I'm all set, and I'm going to be working out, getting ready for that, hopefully the northern trip. I can still hear pretty well. And
We know where Michael's first priority spot will be. It will be. So, and hopefully you don't have a replay of your last experience there.
Yeah, it was exciting.
And that was also necessary because they had a satellite phone, but somehow they got left on, and so the battery died.
Yeah, so the fellow in charge of the phone left it on, and after day 3, we had no communication. So that it's just a whole series of little things where, but sadly, it's important, and that's important too. If you're up there and you have a satellite phone, that the person in charge of the phone has to be aware it's on batteries, and if you let it run for several days, you lose communication. And if the Atlas people don't hear from you, they get concerned, and in our case, so then the storm hit and we got evacuated eventually. But anyway.
Wow. Okay.
I'll just mention that there are solar chargers now, and a lot of things that help remediate some of those kind of issues that we ran into in Atlas too.
But it's really exciting, though, to be involved in that kind of situation, because you're experiencing what the animals up there experience in that habitat, high winds and so on. And so you really get to understand the adaptations they have for those habitats. So, you certainly don't want to be swept away by the wind, or whatever, but to experience a good storm up there is an eye opener and makes you appreciate even more, and how these things are able to live in that rather tough environment. Michael,
we don't want to, guys, don't take it as a, indictment to go out and purposely go out in bad weather. We just want to, we'll do our health and safety due diligence just by putting a disclaimer on that statement, but that sounds exciting. We do have, just for time, there was one thing somebody asked, is there a morning chorus that you should, be doing and recording every morning? I'm sure the answer is yes, but I think it would be helpful, related to that question, just to talk about kind of the general atlasing requirements and hours that you'd like versus the point counts, and just kind of go over that element of the northern trips too. And maybe Mike Cadman, you'd be a good person to cover that.
Yeah, well, the coverage goals are basically the same as Southern Ontario. A minimum of 20 hours in the peak season of atlasing, and then a minimum of 25 point counts. So in that respect, it's very similar. As Michael said, the walking is a lot harder. Getting around between the points is much more difficult, but it actually all does count towards atlasing. So as I said, it takes about a week, including the travel and everything else, to cover a square. I think that should.
Yeah, that covered it. That was good. Yeah. Okay. And then, I'll just take this one last, there's actually 2 questions. Do you guys think we can cover 2 more questions? And then there's an absolute line under that, or, okay.
I'm okay.
You're okay with that? Okay, you have nowhere else to be right now. Somebody asked, do you try to, put together teams and participants that are compatible with one another, or is their compatibility something they're going to find out when they get into the far north?
Yeah, I think we would try and get groups organized as far in advance as possible. So if you have time to get to know the folks you're with, and should conflicts arise, it would be a good time to work those out as far in advance as possible.
That's a good answer.
We don't have any questions on there about, what quirks do you have, or what are you looking for in a partner, and that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
Hopefully that those kind of things, we had great luck with it in previous atlases. We didn't have any complaints.
Sounds like it. Everybody's really interested in birds. That's like one thing in your favor right off the bat.
Yeah.
And then our very last question of the evening is, asking, you're going into, First Nations communities, Indigenous communities, and on their territories. Is there any opportunity or time that you could take to kind of, I don't know, do some outreach and communication with Indigenous communities and community members?
Yeah, there absolutely is. Pete Reed, I saw, was on the call. Pete was very involved with that. Now, he was paid by the Atlas, and he went up and worked in northern communities and did slideshows for them, and collected a lot of Atlas data. But other groups did do things, take along materials that would be of interest, or give talks to the community and that kind of thing. Some of that did happen. And I think there's actually much more opportunity for that kind of thing now with social media. Mike Burrell's the regional coordinator for the far north there is already talking about setting up webinars and that kind of thing to get the northern folks involved. And part of that, it's just occurring to me, maybe we could be telling people that a group is going to be arriving in your community at such and such a time, and make available their services to help with things. They might, when we arrived in Fort Severn, it was on the coast, and of course we're very interested in seeing the tundra, so got some local folks to take us out to the tundra. And we were able to show them some of the dicky birds and such that they hadn't been looking at previously, but learned a lot from them too about their life up in that area. So yeah, we would very much encourage folks with that interest to take advantage of that.
That sounds great. Anyone have anything to add to that point before we kind of go into our final announcements or points anyone wants to make? No? Okay, well, yeah, those are the questions. Thank you so much, everybody. Does anybody have any final Atlas announcements to make, to do with the discussion forums or the newsletter or anything upcoming that we need to know about?
Well, the one thing would be that Sappy Hour in a couple of weeks. I think it's December the 7th. That will be on Wild Tracks and hopefully of interest. Beyond that, no, maybe I'll mention that you can be owling right now. We can count the screech owls and the great horned owls in Southern Ontario if they're singing. So encourage people to get out and do some atlasing. The birds are often very vocal this time of year. A good time to collect some records on them.
You can always kind of be atlasing. It's kind of nice. Well, on that note, I want to say thank you to everybody on the panel. Even those who didn't talk that much on the panel were very active in the background. So thank you to everybody for all your contributions, to the two mics, the one Michael, Adam, and Kaylin. And thank you to everybody who joined us this evening. It was great to see all of your questions. I can see that there's a lot of people who are very excited and very interested in far northern atlasing. So have a great evening, and we'll see you at our next session on Wild Tracks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, guys.
Bye-bye.